Hi, welcome to Artcasters 105. This is the weekly art vlog where we talk about the process of illustration and cartooning and professional art. And we have a rotating guest every week. And the channel basically rotates between myself and Scott. You already know where to kind of find my work. Scott, where can we find your work at?
You can find me right down here. I'm at Circworks.com. I'm at Circworks on YouTube. I do robots, aliens, zombies, and other imminent threats to humanity. And yeah, I do all kinds of stuff, and I got art tips and product reviews and all kinds of stuff on my channel. If you're not familiar, you should check it out.
All right, and I'm really excited to have this guest. It's a really awesome guy that I knew in college. I still keep in touch with via internet, and yet, like, as we've pursued different art careers and stuff, he's just kind of gone on to sort of be in so many movies that every once in a while I go to see a movie with my wife and there's his name in the credits. And so, like, super talented, super amazing, and here is Phillip. Where can we find your work?
My work at my Instagram, it's yes, like Boutte. It's B-O-U-T-T-E. And then I also have my Carbon Made, which is phillipboutejr.carbonmade.com.
Awesome, and we have like a link to that also right down in the show notes. So if you guys didn't catch that or didn't write it down quick enough, you should definitely check out the work. I also linked to his IMDb just so you can see like kind of the quantity of awesome work that he's done. So so Phillip and I went to Cal State Long Beach, really good school, and we were both graduating. I think we graduated, like, was it like a semester apart, or were we in the same group?
I was spring 2006.
Okay, so yeah, so you graduated with my wife, which is awesome.
Yes. Yes.
And actually, they were friends before my wife and I were even engaged. So it's kind of a long history here.
I experienced the magic.
Yeah. So Phillip, we usually have a topic, and this week we thought that it would be good to have just the topic of costume illustration. And I don't even know if that's the right wording for it, but basically illustrating for costume and film. Because that seems like that's kind of how you geared your illustration work and stuff. And yeah. So I think a lot of our viewers and subscribers and stuff would be really fascinated to hear like a little bit of what made you kind of interested in costume illustration, and how'd you kind of start thinking about it? What got you into art in the first place? And actually, just to start off, you might want to mention just a few of the films that you've done just to kind of get them hooked, because you've worked on a lot of pretty amazing films. So, I mean,
always a few questions because I forget. But I did one of my favorites to work on was Inception. That was a really fun one, and that was kind of early on. I've done a few Marvel films, so I did Guardians of the Galaxy 2. I did the upcoming Black Panther, and then A Wrinkle in Time, which will be out. I've also done a lot of the X-Men films. World. Yeah, like it's hard. It's hard for me to name. But I do work on a lot of superhero and specialty costume things, which is things where you'll see either superhero suits or space suits. Oh, I did all of the Star Treks. So the reboot on. I've been lucky enough to be a part of all of those. And then I've also been able to do things like with my friend costume designer Ariane Phillips. I've done the last 3 Madonna tours. So I've been responsible for all her dancers. And I kind of get to see the tour. Fun. So it's like my illustration background has really kind of taken me to different places that I never thought I would be. It's been a really fun experience besides just doing film. So
that's awesome. So like, what kind of like what got you into it? Like what kind of made you interested in film and like working in film?
So my background in history is I've been in the business since I was really little. I've been in the entertainment industry since I was 3. So I was an actor from like 3 until around like 17. And then I decided to stop because I wanted to kind of shift my focus and do behind the scenes stuff and go into kind of looking into what else I could do inside of film and maybe tell my own story. So artistically, I knew that whenever I was in my trailer or when I wasn't working, I would draw. So I decided to go to Cal State Long Beach in the illustration program, which is where I met Josh. And I kind of wanted to explore from a visual narrative. So that made me want to study illustration, maybe even figure out if I wanted a storyboard. And we had a teacher at Long Beach named Robin Richardson. So Robin is a costume illustrator and a storyboard artist. She does both. And so I remember even from our undergrad classes being really excited for the play, where once I got past all of my foundational stuff, like beginning drawing and beginning oil paint and all that stuff, that I would get into my upper division illustration courses and I could take courses with Robin, because at that point, you don't know any of them and you're like, this seems like where I want to be. And she had a costume figure drawing class that was, it's a really long class. I feel like it was from what, like 4 o'clock until like 10 or something like that.
Yeah, it was like, I think a 6 hour. Yeah.
It was a pretty long class, and it was after you had done all the specifications to take. You had to take figure drawing and nude figure drawing and all that first, and figure painting and all of that, and then we finally got to costume, and I really naturally kind of took to that. I enjoyed the gesture of it. I enjoyed the history of it, and kind of trying to figure out what was happening to costumes, or what happens to the body underneath the costume. So it was a really interesting process, but I still didn't know that that's what I wanted to do. It was just a fun class for me. Once we graduated, so we graduated in spring 2006, and I go to Comic-Con every year. So I don't know if some of you, I'm sure some of you go to Comic-Con every year. I went every year through college, used to go all the time. And I went with 2 other students, Brian Valenzuela, who's also a accomplished costume illustrator, and Oksana, I can't say Oksana's last name. It's Indavniaya is her last name. I'll try to say it. She'll kill me if I said it wrong, but I'll try. And we were all students in Long Beach with Josh. And we went to Comic-Con all together after we graduated. So we graduated in June and Comic-Con's in July. And when we got there, we decided we had very broad general portfolios, right? So it's like my portfolio coming out of college is a little bit of everything. It's figure drawing, it's costume, it's sequential imagery, which is like if you were going to make a book. It's storyboards, it's still lifes, just a little bit of everything that I learned, oil painting, all of that. And so I thought, maybe I'd go try to work for a video game company or draw. There was that company, Wizards of the Coast, that does those cards like Magic the Gathering and stuff like that, or maybe do a children's book, or something along, just trying to find your legs as an illustrator. I just wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And on the program, we saw that the Costume Designers Guild was there, Local 892. And they had a panel of famous costume designers that were all working on stuff at different things at the time. So the costume designer from Harry Potter was there. The costume designer from Narnia was there. There was a few different ones, all big names. And we decided, well, why don't we go show them our portfolios? Isn't that what our teacher Robin Richardson does? We were like, yeah. So we go, and we're all young, and we've got our random portfolios. And after the panel, they had an autograph signing. So we went down the line and showed our portfolios. And cut to Oksana, the costume designer from Narnia, really liked Oksana's stuff. Oksana's a very beautiful, talented, her paintings are beautiful watercolors. Like, she's got a very specific style, but also very Josh knows. Like, she was always she would wow us every time she drew anything.
Yeah, like the best explanation of Oksana, if you've been to art school, and you have that one kid in the class who just they could start something like an hour before class and hang it up, and just everybody's like, oh, I suck. because they're that good. Like, she was that person in her class, just like everything she did, at least for me, because I think you had it a little bit too, but I think at that age and at that time, you're really hungry and you want to kind of be the best. And so, like, I was very competitive. Yeah. And I remember every time she'd hang something up in classrooms, just being like, oh, like,
exactly.
You know,
always also hard to think, like, well, can't beat that. Try again.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, it's funny because I attribute, like, when I think back to it, like, why so many people in our graduating class kind of went professional, like, because I don't know if it's that common. Like, I think a good chunk of the people who graduated make their living doing art.
Yeah.
And
you're really competitive.
And I feel like people like Oksana kind of helped bring us all up, you know, like our skills, you know.
She really made us also realize that, like, you know, she always attacked everything right when it started. So she was that kid that, like, by the time the assignment was given, she was already halfway done. Like, that's just the way. That was the way that it was, and it was like knocking it out. So she really upped the game for all of us and upped our skill level by making us up our game, and that's that I am proud of, is that our class, our graduating class, like, we also have Jeremy Spears, who went off now. He's a head story artist. Like, he pitches story for Disney. So he's done a lot of projects. I think his first project was Princess and the Frog, and now I think he's doing Wreck-It Ralph 2.
Oh, and he's doing a thing called Whittle Woodshop, which you guys
Whittle Woodshop was a yes.
Yeah,
let's plug that. The Whittle Woodshop. It's WHITTLE for Whittle, like whittling wood. Go check it out. He's awesome. I buy all of his stuff, and you should too. But yeah, no, they're getting back to that. It was basically Oksana got a call a week after Comic-Con. So this is a week after. It's the month after graduation. A week after going to Comic-Con, and the Isis Musindin, she's the costume designer from Narnia, she called Oksana and said, so I really, really liked your illustrations, and I'm wondering if you would like to go to Prague with me for 8 months to do Narnia 2. This is the phone call she got. A week after Comic-Con and basically a month after graduating from college. So, of course, she said yes. She called me. And she said, Phil, I got this amazing job. Like, I got hired. And so I was like, wow. And then she told me what was going on. And I think at that time, when you join the Costume Designers Guild, because you have to join in order to work on union stuff or whatever, there's like rules. I think the scale for an illustrator at that time was like $37 an hour. So you're coming out of school and, like, that's a real job. You're just like, what? Okay, awesome. It's since has gone up. But at that time, it was like maybe like 10, 11 years ago. At that time, that was a big deal. So she went off and she went to Prague for 8 months and would send pictures or, you know, update, I think at that time, maybe Facebook, with, you know, her journey. And so because of that, I was inspired to join. So then I joined the Costume Designers Guild. And then I immediately, I think a month after I joined, I got my first job, which was the Mummy 3 with Jet Li, with costume designer Sonia Hayes, who I'm working with now. Full circle moment. I'm literally working with her right now on Captain Marvel. So that's my job right now for Marvel. And I did that for 6 months. I had a really long stretch of time with that. And then kind of took some time. I traveled to Montreal while they were filming and got to see like a big set and see action sequences and all that stuff happen. And it was really inspiring. And then I came back and then started to film. So then I did Wolverine and I did, can't think of what else was during that time. There were a few, I think Terminator, Salvation. I don't want to take credit. I totally worked on that movie. And then Brian, the full circle moment, so all three of us, Brian, during the end of that year, this is now 2007, so I worked for almost an entire year. Brian joined the guild, and he got Star Trek. So then because Brian got Star Trek, when they were looking for another illustrator, he recommended me, and then I got on Star Trek. So now we're both on a movie together, which was really fun to work on, because it's like we were classmates, and now we're working on this Star Trek reboot. and we're getting to see stuff, and we get to see all the actors and, you know, the whole thing, like just kind of a reimagining and kind of rebooted this whole franchise. And then from that point on, we've all been working ever since. So really just kind of fell into costume, but I've always known that I like character. I thought that I was going to gear my portfolio, I actually did in school gear my focus towards character design, but we didn't necessarily have a character design program. So it's like I did my general focus in character and costume.
Yeah.
And I think that ended up lending itself really well to me transitioning over into illustrating costumes for costume designers, because then the costume designer in a film is the person that is basically, they design characters with the actor. Like that's their job, right? So they're designing the look, helping the actor find their character. And so for us, we're illustrating that and helping them sell the ideas that they come forward with. But also kind of, you're selling it to everyone. You're selling it to the director, to the actor themselves, like really figuring out what that is. And then I guess I've just been really fortunate to continue to do it now. You know, it's going on, I guess my first job was like really January 2007. So I was, yeah, this is my 10th year doing that job.
That's so rad. So like it's like within that like year period kind of between like, you know, when you graduated and like, you know, that first gig, like, you know, did you like, because I remember really vividly like my first time like getting out of school, and I had some freelance and stuff, but it just kind of felt like the floor dropped out from under me for a little bit. And it was like this frightening kind of moment where there's a lot of potential, but a lot of fear, you know? I wondered, I'm kind of curious if you had that, like when you first got out, like were you worried that you couldn't get work like as an illustrator? Did you have that kind of stuff going on, like the hunting and?
I did, and I think that, so I didn't want to confuse everyone because I tried to keep it just general in like terms of illustration, but the one thing that everybody kind of remembers in terms of like my career is that I balanced costume illustration with production design. So while we were in college still, I was an illustration major and I minored in film because I knew that I wanted to combine those two things. And then as the programs got more intense, I dropped film because it was too hard to continue in both because they're both really, you know, intense programs. But I was still friends with all the film students. So film students wanted me to then, because I had an artistic background, into production design. And I was like, well, what's that? And they're like, they're the people that design the sets, all the sets and like the general look of a film. So I was like, well, that sounds fun. So I started to do that. So in college, very early on, I was illustrating and learning, you know, building up my illustration skills. But then in off terms, like winter break or summer or whatever, I was production designing. So I was doing either student films or I was doing music videos or I was doing, you know, little small commercials or whatever it was. So I was constantly working in film and doing illustration at the same time. And trying to balance those two things. So when I graduated, I think the one thing that someone told me very early on, which I was really lucky, is that I used to always ask that question that Josh is saying now, like, when you get out of school, what do you do, right? And someone very early on told me that when you get out of school and you start to work, it takes a good 3 years or so before you have to stop calling people and people call you. Yeah. Whatever you're doing, once you dedicate the time, it takes a good 3 years for that to really start to pick up. And I think now that process might be shorter because of the internet, you know, like it makes it a little easier for people to contact. But I remember knowing that, and it was in the back of my head. And so I figured if I could do production design jobs and work, then by the time I got out of school, I had put in that 3 years. Yeah. So one that did happen is it did pay off. So whereas I was looking for illustration work, the timing between Comic-Con and when I got my first job, I joined, Oksana got hired in July of 2006. And then I didn't join the guild until I think either November or December of 2006. Because I was like, I was still trying to figure stuff out. I had production design jobs, so I wasn't like completely flat broke or like trying to figure it out. And then I had my regular job. I worked at a credit union in Cerritos. So I still had work, and I was kind of balancing those things and trying to still figure out. And I did feel that drop where you're like, what am I going to do? But I remember being very focused on just knowing I need to do something artistic for work. And so I was very focused on taking jobs that would allow me to do that. So I eventually dropped my credit union job, and I tried to do jobs that only furthered art in some capacity. So I would take production design jobs, I'd work on commercials, I'd PA, I'd do whatever it is that I needed to stay in a creative field. And I dropped the credit union because at a certain point I was getting better at that job, and they kept promoting me. So it was like, well, first you work the front desk, and now you manage the bills, and now you're doing loans. And then I became a loan officer, and I was like, okay, I'm now becoming a banker. I don't want to do that. So I dropped that and basically said, I need to focus every attention I can, even if it's working at an art store or a photography store or whatever, I need to focus. So that time between Comic-Con and like November, December when I joined, I was just either production designing or doing, you know, little jobs here and there that were artistically based. And then I got hired in January of 2007, and that's when my art career took off. And then, so I worked a good 6 months on my first job, took some time off, production designed some music videos for a company called London Alley, which now is huge and does all these music videos. Shout out to Luga. Check out London Alley if you get a chance. I worked for them for a good solid 3 years, and I literally jumped back and forth during those 3 years between I do, you know, a stretch of music videos and commercials, and then I would switch to doing like a film for like a month, like drawing and illustrating costumes for a costume designer. And that process continued to happen, and it would go back and forth until one of them started to kind of take more precedence. And the costume illustration for me, because I got in at a really good time, I got in at a time where illustration started to go digital. So we had learned Photoshop, I think like the last semester of our class, we learned Photoshop. Like we had all this traditional training, wash, watercolor, pastels, you know, Conti, charcoal, ink, like Josh is doing right now, all of those things. We had all of that training. And then I remember learning Photoshop our last semester. So we were able to digitally do something that our costume illustrators couldn't do before, which is we could scan in fabrics into our illustrations. So we could draw, scan in our line drawing or our pencil drawing, paint it in Photoshop, and then also scan the fabric that the designer wanted to use, and that was like the new thing. So that started to pick up. So by the time I had put in the time to do the illustration, and I was going back and forth from production design to that, costume illustration really started to take off. And at the height of it, where I was working most, my daughter was born. So at that point, then you kind of have the responsibility of family and everything else. So my career really shifted almost to primarily costume illustration, and every once in a while I'll do a production design job, like if I'm off or if I have time. Mm-hmm. So I feel like I was very focused on knowing that I at least needed to put in the legwork, and it's something that I tell students all the time, is that if you get an opportunity when you have your break, don't just like completely go on break, do something that furthers your passion. So it's like, if you want to be a photographer, go travel, but still take your photos, like, or do something in that field. Keep your focus, your singular focus on kind of trying to etch in, because you're never going to know where you're going to land. Like, I didn't study to be a costume illustrator. Like, I didn't come from a fashion background. It's not my deal. I just love characters and I like drawing them. So I didn't know that I was going to end up there. And I also have a broad, diverse background of also doing, you know, production design. So I was kind of in a way where I just geared myself towards, I knew I love film, art, and I just tried to find ways of narrowing down what I wanted to do there and how to combine it.
See,
Focus.
I think you're touching on some really like important things, like, and Scott and I have talked about this before, but it's like, you know, the idea of really targeting, because when I think back, like, you know, there's a lot of luck, at least for me in my career, that like kind of led to things. But a lot of that luck was because I was like, you know, I got an in-house job doing illustration, and I hated that job. So while I was doing that job, I did illustration work on the side, and I tried like t-shirt design because I like doing graphic, just like, you know, hand inked stuff, and I was having to do all this like vector line stuff at work, and like constantly kind of staying targeted on something that I wanted to do. So like even if I ended up in like a creative thing that was like not what I wanted to do, always kind of making sure like when I'm off work, spend like 2 or 3 hours on the thing I want to do. And for me, I think that like that kind of singular focus where I picked industries, like I specifically wanted to do t-shirts. And so I targeted t-shirts. I specifically wanted to do comics. I targeted comics. It seems like, you know, you're going to have a lot more luck, like, you know, and you're going to level up in your skill if you're constantly working at it, but you're also going to have a lot more of those opportunities. Like Oksana had like an insane opportunity. That rarely happens. I mean, she had the talent, but had she never gone to Comic-Con, who knows, right? So she had the talent, and then she was hustling, and I think targeting, and I think that really helps because I do feel like a lot of illustrators, some of the illustrators I know that have had less success in illustration than like someone like you, like Phillip. You know, it's like a lot of them don't. Like they have like a split focus where it's like kind of like you were describing, and I remember feeling that when I got out of school too. Like I had interest, but I was like, hey, I'll do anything that's drawing, that's pay, you know? Right. Because it's like I like kids' books. I like a lot of stuff. I like animation. I like you know, I like book cover design. I like all sorts of stuff. And like if you try to just target, at least I feel like that's really good advice what you're saying, because if you try to just target everything, I think you have a lot less. It's like scattershot. You just have a lot less chance of like hitting a target.
It's because it's harder to find that singular thing. You don't have to have just one thing, but it's harder to find that thing that you can really focus on if you're constantly splitting your focus out to different things. So, yeah. And also too, I tell, you know, everyone like, right, like it may not feel like it in college, but it's like, it's not that serious. Not in terms of like your job and your career and everything that's serious, but the responsibilities you face in college are like pale in comparison to providing for a family or, you know, having a kid, or like even just a few years out of school when you start to have bigger adult responsibilities. So it's like, really need to take advantage of that time and explore, like be creative. If you have an inkling even for a second that you might want to try something, try it, but try to hone in on focusing in on the core of what your talent is in art or whatever it is, and then pushing yourself to learn as much as you can. So once I started to know that I wanted to do character, I started to study costume, and I started to study, you know, I started looking up fashion designers, and I started to say like, you know, this isn't something that I had a natural interest in, but now I'm like, who are these fashion designers? So I started looking up like Alexander McQueen and Rick Owens and Gareth Pugh and all of those places, and, you know, John Galliano. Like those are all names that, like, if you're familiar with fashion, they're big, huge fashion designers, but they do some really cool stuff that really starts to look more like concept art, but in real life. So as I started to draw more on that and started to learn more, it expressed my interest in a way that I wasn't necessarily looking for at first. Yeah. And it started to really make me aware of what I wanted to do, you know. Yes. You know, and I knew that film.
Yeah, so there are like a lot of really interesting kind of unique considerations. I mean, like Scott and I do comics. There's a lot of weird kind of considerations to like paneling and layout and hand-done typography and stuff, you know. And t-shirt design had its own niches, like no borders, like a lot of you know, like little rules that you kind of learn, and then you start knowing the culture and you start knowing the history, and like when you learn the history, it starts informing your current work. But like I'm so fascinated by costume illustration because, like, you know, like you, Brian, Oksana, like a lot of people like I know like got into that field, and yet it's weird because I've seen even the work you guys have done, but I'm still like a layman when it comes to like what goes into the whole thing. And like particularly like on a level of like craft, you know. So I was kind of curious, like I mean, I do remember from school, like most of what I know is what I remember from Robin teaching, you know, in that costume figure class. And that, for me, that was a really frustrating class because I didn't understand life drawing at that point. It's weird. It's like a year or two later where like life drawing clicked for me, and I was like, oh man, I like doing contours fun. Like the rendering stuff's boring, you know. But it took a while to where it just like suddenly felt free and loose and like you can see form, you know. But it takes a lot of, you know, like for me, I'm a slow learner, so I think it took me a while. But I do remember in that class, like she talked about specific things like certain eras having like a double seam line on the back, and like, you know, there was all this historical research involved, and it just sounds like a really fascinating kind of like job, especially for people who are like truth seekers and like are interested in looking at history and studying and researching and applying that to drawing. So anyhow, that just got me thinking about like what kinds of considerations you have to have as an illustrator, because it's not, you're not just illustrating, you're also, you know, it has this function that's so, it's very different from the stuff I've done professionally. So I'm
yeah, I was going to ask Phil the same thing, because just, you know, because that stuff comes into play in comics too, because the comic books that I've created have always taken, you know, they're always sort of period pieces. So I do a lot of research, but for you, Phil, I mean, you're going from one property to the next. So it's, I mean, I'm curious how much research actually goes into that and how true it actually has to be and how much time you spend researching versus actually illustrating and all that. And where do you go? How do you go about doing your research to find that stuff out?
Those are good questions. It's a big process, because so the costume department is, you know, mini. So you have your costume designer, right? And then you have like a costume supervisor that helps kind of like manage, like helps the costume designer manage like budget and all of those things, and kind of like it's hard for me to explain like the ins and outs of like the job. Then you have like an assistant costume designer who's basically can do the same thing that the costume designer can do. So they help them kind of like go and like facilitate like picking up like fabrics and sourcing and shopping and all of that stuff, right? And then you have like people that are called like ager dyers. They're the people that like, they're the ones that like, if you buy a shirt, they're the ones that make it look like it's been worn or take it down so it's new, or they're the ones that dye fabric from one color to the next, you know, to make a costume. So you get the fabric and then dye it this color and then, you know, wear it down and age it and all of that. And there's costumers that are a part of Local 705. They're the ones that go out and they physically handle the clothes and pull them, and they might work with the actor. They're the ones that work with the actors to help them get dressed in their costumes. So there's a whole, I'm hoping I'm not leaving anything out, but there's a whole, including my job, which is a costume illustrator, or like basically now as we're starting to kind of transition, we also sometimes call ourselves costume concept artists, because concept art in itself is like this kind of like gigantic part of the industry now in terms of this industry standard, right? So we end up being concept artists for costume designers, which is basically traditional costume illustration in its core is you are working for the costume designer. So you are basically costume designer on my first day, usually working. I come in, I read the script if it's available, so that I'm on the same page. And the costume designer usually at this point has already been on like a couple of weeks or so, or sometimes a week or whatever, and they have these boards. So they put up illustration board or you know, display boards that have images that they've pulled for each character. So that could be images from Pinterest, it could be Google, it could be a fashion collection, it could be something like, it could be textures, it could be just a mood. It's like a mood board for each character that they've kind of researched. So like, if we're working on Oblivion with Tom Cruise, right? The costume designer had like a board that had like grays and whites and motocross stuff and like that type of deal, right? for Tom Cruise's character, and then for another character there might be something else. But it's like very much so you should be able to look at this board and get an idea of what the costume designer has in mind for that character, right? Then my job comes in. So I'm studying those. The costume designer tells me what costume they want to start with, and they'll say, okay, we're going to draw A, B, and C and try and figure this out. Sometimes they'll have, like, maybe they might do a little sketch. They might have a piece of fabric, or sometimes they might just have a general idea, and conceptually we help figure it out. You know what I mean? So we'll draw 3 or 4 versions, but the general dictation comes from them, and then they kind of send us off on this journey and kind of art direct us to a finish. So that's kind of the general thing. As I've gone along, like, we also have, there's researchers. So there's costume, like, you might have researchers or like PAs that are grabbing, I don't know if PAs research. There's a specific, I guess, job title where you have like people that do research for costume, right? Yeah. So they're pulling references. The costume designer might have books, and so there's someone consistently pulling information about these things. So if you're doing a period piece, like if you're in the 70s, there's someone pulling from like JCPenney catalogs and all those things, and Macy's catalogs, and like going back and looking at like real pictures of how people dressed at that time, how they wore their clothes, what was popular, what wasn't popular. Yeah. That type of deal. So the best part about the job for me that I found is the history. It's when I worked on The Mummy. Like, I'm fresh out of school, don't know anything really about, lots of different cultures, and I'm on this huge movie where it's basically about ancient China. And so I learned about terracotta warriors, and I learned about archers, and I learned about armor, and I learned about, different types of statues and like jade, and like it's like an education of those things. And then we all know, especially because we draw, you can't draw things that you don't understand. So the only way for you to get better is you have to learn, right? You have to know, like, okay, like you were saying, like, if I'm in this period, dresses were only this high, or this was only this way, or corsets were made this way, or dresses were made to accentuate the hips, or whatever it is. The more you know, the better your drawings will be, right? So yeah. That's kind of been an interesting thing. So as I jump, like, I mean, like for me now, even when I look back on working on Black Panther, right? Black Panther was amazing because I learned so much about African culture. Like, I learned about different tribes and why they do things. And I learned, like, if you see those crazy beaded necklaces around, the neck, those beads and the colors actually mean something. So they could mean that, a woman is in mourning, or I think one of the more interesting stories, forgive me because I've forgotten the tribe now, but I think you'll see this tribe that has all these layered necklaces of beads, right? And they look like rings. And what I found out was that the beads are basically males give the females these beads as like almost like suitors. So the more beads you have, it's a symbol of beauty, meaning that you're sought after. Huh. And so it's an interesting thing, but like before you would just look at it and think they make them, but each one that the girl has is from someone else, like from another suitor or someone that liked her, or it was a gift or whatever. And the black beads usually either represent, it was that the woman is married or in mourning from like losing a spouse. So it kind of is a way that they separate out and they know like who's who in the tribe. But it was things like that. Like, that's just something that I can't put into words in terms of being able to learn what those things mean and learn them and like really know them, as opposed to just knowing them visually. And then also being able to then have fun with them and conceptually play with the costume designer, that one was Ruth Carter, who we call Truth. Playing with her to figure out kind of like the balance between what to take, which was the real, and how to push it to somewhere else. But it's the costume department in itself is just many people, all under the costume designer's tutelage, and then everyone's working, and you just have a ton of creative people. That's like the best way I can describe it. It's not just one person, it's an entire village of people all doing the costumes, but all with a specified skill. So when you talk about like specialty costuming, you think about like, how do they make that armor? There's specialty shops like Ironhead Studios and Film Illusions and Quantum Creations or Quantum Creation Effects, Legacy. Like there's all these different companies that you'll hear about that do specialty costume, which is they're the ones that sculpt and mold and do creatures and like your helmets and all those things, the superhero suits, all of those things get made there based on their expertise, and then the costume designer has to work with them. So, and then we have specialty costumers that work in costume that are there actually on site that are putting together costumes like that are, and then you have cutter fitters like that are like they're the people that do the flats for the costumes and then figure out what the costume is going to be like on the body with the costume designer. So they're the ones that physically make the costumes. So it's definitely, it's hard to explain, but the crews are massive and you have a lot of people, especially on bigger projects, and you're all just trying to figure it out. So my general day is I get to work, around 8:30, and then I work until around 6:30. So it's like a 10-hour day, basically. And sometimes longer, depending on if, they need us to stay. And you're just working on characters all day long. So you're figuring stuff out, you move on. There might be a meeting, so you have a deadline, so your costume designer has to take the illustrations. And then research-wise, I also do my own research. So it's like, whereas the costume designer gives me stuff, I also pull stuff that kind of helps me figure things out as well. And then I'm constantly doing a mix between kind of either, I used to hand draw a lot more, but now I primarily am working on a Cintiq and I'm drawing digitally in my computer. And then I'm using a mix between that and photography and painting and going back and forth between those things, and then pulling stuff from the board that the costume designer is giving me, stuff that they like. And you're just trying to kind of put it all back together in a way that sells the idea.
Yeah.
And that's my job. It's like, that's pretty much my day to day, Monday through Friday, sometimes on weekends. Sometimes I come home and I work on something else. I think something you touched on earlier, it's also really important to draw for yourself. So I try to find time to just have something that's not like just something I like.
Yeah.
So I don't lose that process. But it's a pipeline. It really is. And then as you get every project, you learn something new. So at the end of it, I'll look back and I'm like, oh, I do know that, or I do know this designer, or I do know how that's made, because I have to draw it. I've got to figure it out.
For sure. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to say, it's interesting because when I asked that question, I literally had no idea how that process happened. But as you start to explain it, it's similar to a lot of other areas, as far as production art or whatever. I mean, my first art job was designing architectural renderings for like, we did a lot of retail stuff, but we got to do some cool stuff. Like we did all the Warner Brothers studio stores and, Sesame Strip Shop stores and just some really cool stuff. But we had, in addition to the architectural part and the graphic design part and the illustration, we also had interior designers, and they would do the same thing with the boards, because they did all the interior design as well. So they would present you with all of the different materials. This is the color we're going to use. This is, this is the wallpaper. This is everything. And then, we would have to illustrate that. So it's right. Similar to that. And it's even like right now, I'm sort of in the paper craft industry, my day job, where I design rubber stamps. But it's the same thing where they basically, these are the current trends, and you get these mood boards and everything like that. So it's really not that different to what I'm familiar with, but I guess I wasn't in that headspace. But now that you explain it, it's like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense.
It's funny too, because I've been doing it for so long and I'm still learning. The costume department is so massive. It's like trying to figure out like everyone's job and what they do. It's like everyone's doing a specific thing. Like there are people that just go around town and fabric source. So they're the person that they go and pull fabrics from everywhere, downtown, they order fabrics from Italy, wherever they're from, to get stuff to show the costume designer so that they have options for the costumes that they're currently designing or that we're working on, right? But then you also have big places like a place called Western Costume that I've worked at for years now. It's one of the places where It's basically, it's office space, but it's also a huge warehouse that houses costumes and costume collections. So that's one thing that people don't really know in terms of the industry. Western is a place, it's run by a guy, a really nice guy named Eddie Marks. And it's basically, they have office space where costume designers will set up, right? So they set up a workspace where they've got an office, and then that's usually where I come. So I bring my computer and set up, and I've got a place to work, and you've got the PAs, and you've got the assistant costume designer, and the supervisor, and all those people. So we're all together in this office and kind of starting a film, right? And then in the back, there's this huge warehouse. I can't even explain it. Like, imagine the cleaners times like a billion. Like, and it's all organized by, like, you know, there's huge racks of clothes that are stacked, you know, like 4 or 5 high or however long. And it's just like, it's just, imagine like jackets and like all different periods. So it's like, if you want Western stuff, there's like chaps and pants and cowboy hats and like shoes. And then imagine that for every time period. So you've got Victorian stuff. You've got one of my favorite aisles to go down when I first, you know, started to work at Western was they have all the costumes from Waterworld still there. So you can go down this aisle and Galaxy Quest. So it's like all these different things where you can rent these costumes and you can rent pieces of them. But the whole warehouse is full of costumes from different movies that have then been donated or brought back or bought by Western Costumes so that they can be rented and used over. So it's like, if you're doing, you know, a Civil War piece, there's a whole military section. If you're doing army, or if you're doing like jail, or, you know, anything you can think of, basically, like when you see extras, the main characters are always designed by the costume designer, right? And they also do the background, but background, they pull clothes for those. So it's not like they're making new clothes for every single person. If you're doing a Western, you know, like, what was it like, or even just like a fun one, like Cowboys and, what was it, Cowboys and Aliens or whatever. The main characters are designed, right? But then the costume designer also has to dress all the extras, like the people in the town. And so all of those costumes come from rental houses, basically. So they're pulling those costumes. So costumers are going out and pulling costumes all day long based on what the costume designer has told them. And then you have fittings, which is like actors come in and extras come in, and then they're putting the clothes on and taking photographs to show the general feel of how this thing's gonna look. And then for us, our day-to-day is literally drawing with the costume designer to figure out the looks of the main characters. So it's like a whole, it really is the whole department. So it works very similar. It's a creative department, you know? So it's like,
it's just I think that the unique thing about film, you know, it's like, I think it's a plus and a minus of film is that it's so collaborative.
Yeah.
Because, you know, like thinking about that, like I'm thinking my first day on a job, like in an art team that was like, it was a decent size, but it was only like 20 artists, you know, and that's it. And then like, you know, it was like a company of a couple hundred people. And
right.
The one I work at now, it's only like 7 or 8 artists, and then, you know, freelance, and then 50 people max, you know. And like, when I think about like my first days on those jobs, it's like, you know, I think about, you know, just like feeling really overwhelmed and a little out of my depth, which I think the longer you've been at it, like by now, I'm sure when you're on a set, you might maybe have that in the back of your head, and you're just like, yeah, but I've done like so many of these, so, you know, it's like, it works. It's weird, but it works. But like, I imagine, like, was it intimidating as hell to be on a set and have like all these different people you may not have even known, like the positions of, kind of coming up to you and maybe saying like, oh, do this, and you're like, are you my super, like, who are, what? I mean, it seems like a really confusing, although I'm sure it's very organized too, to get that kind of, I mean, just that amount of people to kind of gel together.
It's more learning the things. It does in costume, at least in terms of the organization, feel like you can kind of figure it out. You don't really, like, I don't have to interact. Like, I interact with a lot of people now, especially because I know what their jobs are and I've worked with them so many times. But initially, it was more like I'm sitting and drawing, and I'm usually in an office next to the costume designer, or like in a space where we're really close to them.
Yeah.
They kind of come in and kind of download what they want you to do for the day. So they'll tell you, you know, we've got, Don Cheadle, and he's in a suit, and if I want, a pinstripe suit that's navy blue, that type of deal, and, make it so that it doesn't fit very well because his character's a slob. Like, they'll give you the general gist of what it is, and then also say, can you try some variations of shirts and ties or whatever it is until I get back? Also, everyone has to be noted, the costume designer is busy. So they don't just sit in the office all day. They've got meetings, and they've got to go talk to the director, and they've got to go like do a fitting with an actor and meet the actor and get their sizes. And so there's a lot of different things happening during the day. And then we're just trying to kind of make sure that we're showing support by making sure that we're keeping on task with what it is they need accomplished, but also keeping track of our schedule so that we're ready for meetings. So it's like, I might have a couple of days and they're like, okay, I've got a meeting with the director on Wednesday at 4. So we need to have all the illustrations done so we can go over them, print them, and then, put the presentation together. Then the costume designer goes off to the meeting. Sometimes we go with them, depending on if it's conceptual and they need us to be there to hear what's going to be said. But they really do go in and they're pitching those ideas and those designs to kind of get them sold and hand it off, so then they can hand over that design to all those other people I mentioned. So once the design, that's something that also made my illustration change too, is I realized how specific I had to be, because my illustration doesn't just sell that idea, it also goes to everybody else. So it's like, it made me have to focus, because it's like, if I draw something a weird shape and it's not what the costume designer wants, then the next person it's like a really like horrible game of like phone tag, or telephone, where it's like, you're whispering in someone's ear and they have to keep telling the message. That's what our drawing does. It goes through the whole department. So it's like, it goes to the suit maker, and then it goes to the ager dyer, and it goes to this person. They're all working off that illustration. So it's become really important to also learn like the difference between things. Like if your designer says that they want a regular pleat versus like a sun pleat, you need to know what that is, because otherwise if you draw it incorrectly, you're giving off information that's not what they wanted, So it's like, or you have to be able to be clear in your materials. You have to show, this is silk, this is chiffon, this is leather, this is cotton. Like it's like all of those things. And if you're not able to do that, so it becomes a little bit more specific, because otherwise it confuses everybody. So
was that challenging to like learn? I mean, that sounds really, because you also have to find like a shorthand for that, because you're on these time constraints.
Yeah.
It's like in shorthand, if my brain right now tries to think of chiffon versus silk and how I can render that quickly, it's just like, I'm just imagining, like, once again, I'm imagining like now you can probably do that. Like initially where you just for me, like, I'm like, is a pleat the thing in the pants that's like, is that the part that's like iron? And like, it seems like
very hard.
Learning curve to have to learn that, because you're really you're having to focus on texture, on detail, on accuracy. Like,
it was hard. I mean, I think the one thing that we had on our side was that it transitioned from like, my skill set continued to grow. And I wasn't always conceptual. I was very linear. I've always been a very linear illustrator, which is like, form for me has caused issue. Like you said, it takes a long time to be able to turn form in your head, and to also then be able to get that in your illustration to where it's believable. So I would always go back and forth between either being very like, I don't want to say cartoony, but I gravitated towards non-realistic proportions. So one of my first challenges was like, when people wanted them to be fashion illustrations, was figuring out how to stretch proportions and knowing your anatomy in order to do that and break the rules. And then I started to get more realistic proportions. And then it kind of transitioned into doing, not just like kind of like flat illustration, but I was turning form. And then as I started to work more with concept artists, it was about making things look a little bit more like photography and photoreal. So now I'm trying to institute using like kind of like the photo bash technique, where I bring in photographs into my illustrations and then try to figure out how that works. It's like growing pains. Like every new step, there'd be a point where you're just like, man, I don't like the way this looks. Or like, if I use a photograph, it's really fighting my illustration and making it to where it doesn't make sense. So it's like, and then you're dealing with like all those issues. And then on top of all of that, you're dealing with these things like you're saying, like, how do I make this look like chiffon versus silk, and how do I do that in the 3 hours I have, or the 2 hours, or the 15 minutes I have to put this sketch together really quickly. So you kind of, I think that that's where our training at Long Beach really helped me, was our program was so diverse that my skill set is diverse. Like I think that's why it's hard sometimes for me to explain it, because depending on what my challenge is, I approach it different ways. So one thing I tell students too is that it's important to still have your foundation, because you do end up approaching anything digital, you still approach it very similar to the way you do it practically or in real life. So, and then digital then too has its own rules, where there's stuff you can do there that you can't do in real life. Like you can take watercolor and immediately put oil paint on top of it if you want to. Or I remember one of the times where I started to learn to use digital way back when, to use it creatively, was I was told to do a blouse for an actress that was supposed to look like, I think it's taffeta. And taffeta, I feel like that's the right term. Taffeta, when you look at it, it's a fabric that has this like moire effect to it. When you look at it, it's got rings, right? Like kind of this, like when you look at it, it's stroke.
Yeah.
Didn't figure out, I did a flat illustration. I actually did that one in Illustrator. Like it was very graphic and flat when I was trying to kind of figure that style out. But I couldn't figure out how to get the taffeta effect. And you can't really scan it because it doesn't scan well. That pattern won't come out. And taking photographs of it at the time was problematic. It just didn't look right. And so digitally, I told myself, I was like, well, what has rings? And so I looked up photographs of tree rings, like the inside of the tree, and then I overlaid those into my drawing and turned the opacity down and kind of played with all of those settings, and then I got the effect I wanted. Then that was like one of the times where it made me realize like digital also has its own set of rules where you're not beholden to things you can do in real life. And it's kind of like, it can elevate things and kind of make it, you know, it was a whole nother form of creativity thinking that in that way. And now that's just kind of standard for the course, you know, the way people think now. But it was like kind of coming to conclusions like that early on really kind of informed where I wanted to go.
And I think what you were saying about like the ability to like switch mediums and stuff is really important. Like I think about like even my day job, it's just like I'm having to art direct people, and a lot of people get stuck in specific styles.
Yeah.
You know? And the type of work we're doing, it's like your style needs to be really flexible depending on the client. You know, because if you're doing something for like Fender, it's a little different than what you're doing for like Warner Brothers. You know, it's like it's just a different look, it's a different feel, it's a different color palette, and it's like, and it's super quick turnaround. So it's like you have to be able to just kind of bounce really quickly to like, I'm doing futurist design, and now I'm doing heavy like cartoon illustration, and now I'm doing photorealism. It's like
that's hard when you switch movies too, because you'll go from something like I'll be drawing African things at one point, and then I'm drawing like Norse things at some other point, and then I'm drawing like the 90s. You know what I mean? Like it's really hard to kind of like, especially you know, especially if the projects start to overlap, it's hard to put yourself in a frame of mind.
Yeah, I didn't even think about what you were saying though, like with the way that our program was structured, where you were required to take like typography. We're illustration majors.
Yeah.
But we had to take typography, we had to take like...
All helps.
Yeah, like basic watercolor, intro to watercolor. We had to take like, I think like, what is it, what was the painting class? Like we had to learn how to oil paint. We had to learn all these different mediums. 2D design, we're doing just abstract, like, you know, collages and weird kind of like color theory and stuff like that. And it's all of that, being able, I think having that flexibility really does help, because it's funny, sorry for mentioning it, it's just like, it felt like you kind of hit a thing that I was like, oh, I never even thought about that. But that's always been one of my strengths. And I think that might be from Cal State Long Beach a little bit, with that, the flexibility to switch styles, you know?
That's the one compliment that I usually get, or the thing that's helped me stay kind of working, is that I'm able to adapt, or I don't, like, I have my own personal style, but when I'm on a project, I try to get my skills to closely match the artistic value or the feeling or the mood of what I'm working on. So like, and it does help because then sometimes like if I put my illustrations all up at the same time, like stuff I've worked on, you really would think some of them were done by separate people because it's like I switch styles so often that it doesn't seem like it's the same person. And I really do accredit our program to that. Like, so I did Kingsman, The Golden Circle, right?
Yeah,
and
I was going to bring that up. The style you did that in
is completely different than what I normally do.
It's rad, though. I really like it because you really got that kind of mid-century modern kind of feel to like the layouts and stuff.
It was the director. It's Matthew Vaughn, and he wanted to. It was very much so his thing. Between him and Ariane, the costume designer, they wanted. He basically likes because it's Kingsman's like it's comic book, so he wanted the illustrations to feel like a comic book in a way. So it was like a good diversion for me, but also too it challenged me because I was so used to kind of like at this point I've been using like 3D programs. Like sometimes I'll use Dash 3D to like pose a figure for myself really quickly, and then I kind of get the general thing, light it really quick, and then I'll like throw it in ZBrush and do some other stuff like sculpt on it or whatever, just to get a general pose down, and then I start to draw on top of that and paint and put photographs and all that. So it was interesting for me to think of a challenge of doing costume illustration, but having to like really draw from scratch, like to just draw, like physically draw. But I was really excited for it because oftentimes now too, we end up having to sell things with so much technology that we don't get a chance to sketch to sell things as much anymore. At least on like bigger projects where they really need you to figure it out. So it was really nice to kind of take that deviation and that break and draw traditionally. And I always welcome that change.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I saw a bunch of those that you posted on Instagram, and it was just like, I think it fit like some of my favorite aesthetics, but I also felt like, wow, man, Phil's just like once again, you're flexible. You can switch kind of gears on your style, and so when you're on a film like that, like you were talking about, like trying to do personal work, and I kind of like, I'm kind of curious about that. Like for me, doing in-house like art direction, it can get wearing if I'm not working on personal work.
Yeah.
You know? And I'm curious, like, do you have that? Like, do you have times where you're like working on? I mean, it sounds like, I mean, obviously an industry you're passionate about, you love, you're getting, like beautiful portfolio work out of it. And at this point, you probably don't even need a portfolio, to get the work. But the point being, it's like, do you kind of have those days though where you're just like, man, I'm just sick of drawing somebody else's idea? Like
all the time. Like, yeah. Like I think it's more so because I work a lot, so I do find like if I'm starting to, my wife will say something like, you seem stressed, or or when I can just tell I don't feel like myself, it's usually because I have to remind myself I'm probably artistically burned out, meaning that creatively you need a break. Like, so I find when I'm able to take a break, even if it's just a week or so, and it needs like a solid break with just time off, when I come back, I'm usually a little bit more refreshed. But it's like, I think the switching of projects, and then also consistently, because costume illustration in itself is so collaborative, you constantly are attached to the costume designer and their creative process. And it's important still for an illustrator to have your own personal thought process and your own personal way of doing things. Like, it's like, if you want to draw lips and you draw them a specific way, it's important for you to have that in your head as like the way you do it, and not have to change it based on someone else. And that's like no qualm to the job itself. I enjoy the job, but you do need that. As an artist, every artist has their own ego, and you have to feed your ego by doing things creatively that you either enjoy or come from yourself. So you can't do the job so much that you lose that part of yourself. And I think that that's something that I try to make clear to everyone that even asks about the job, because everyone's like, it's so awesome and you work all the time. But it's just like, I'm like, all of us are just like everybody else. There are points, no matter what job and no matter how much you love it, you have to take like personal care to do something that you like to do, or you will get burned out. And I find too, the burnout here can be pretty bright just because you are switching from, you're collaborating with someone else, and then you're also switching genres, which is really challenging, and you don't realize that that influx of information can be overwhelming. So it's almost like, it's like if you've ever been social media burned out, where you're just like, I don't need to know this much about everyone ever. Like, you know what I mean? We're just like, I need to cut my social media off for like a week or something, just to center myself back into my life. I think that this job in particular is also that way. Sometimes, you know, if you've been working on a project for a few months, you're really invested in like whatever that culture is or that time period. So switching gears all of a sudden feels like a jarring thing. And like I'm usually pretty good at it, but it's like at sometimes it's too much, where I'm like, I'm still stuck in the 1970s and now I'm like face. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, so my aesthetics have to continue to change. And then also too, it's like you said, when you get into school, some of the stuff you learn in school, you won't grasp it or even remotely understand what your teacher was saying until like a couple years later. So sometimes what happens on those projects is you retain information, and then it makes it hard. Sometimes, like if I'm working, I forget what I was working on before Black Panther. I know I was doing A Wrinkle in Time, which is completely outside of that box of that. It's like more avant-garde, high fashion. It's a mix between a few things, and then you go to Black Panther. And Black Panther was very, you know, African. So I studied a lot of African art and sculptures and their clothing and like their ritualistic tattoos and all that stuff, right? And that has its own visual language. So there's not a lot of like accelerating curves. There's not like, it's very simplistic in a way. So I started to gear my aesthetic around that. But then directly after that, I switched to something else, right? So I've worked on that for a few months. Then I switched to another movie. And then I find that like trying to get myself out of that African aesthetic was difficult. Because it's like you're looking at it and saying like, I don't want to do these sharp interweaving lines. I want to do simplistic lines because that's what African art does. And then, so it's hard. And so you can get burned out. So from work, I try to find time now where like, I'm like, even if it's just an hour a week, like if that's all I can get, I just need to draw something where I'm making my own choices. You know, and I think that that's also something to speak to the fact that out of school too, I also thought that I would do something more corporate. Like I thought I'd work at like Lakeshore, or I'd be working in a studio, and I completely never really did that. Like I haven't had a corporate job. I'm primarily freelance. I've been freelance right out of school. So it's like I find jobs, I either get hired by a costume designer, or I go and look for work, or you know, every once in a while still do something for production design, but I've been completely freelance. So the part for freelancers that I always try to say too is that, you know, sometimes you get freelance burnout, where there are points, because since I have a family, I get tired of having to worry about what my next job is. Like there's sometimes where I'm like, can I just work at DreamWorks and be there and see the same people every day and work on a movie for like 3 years and not have to worry like what's next, you know?
Then again, I mean, you know, this is just to counter that a little bit, but it's like, you know, we have a freelancer right now at my work who just got laid off from DreamWorks. So I mean, I don't know, and like my work laid me off tomorrow. You know, like
that's the other thing. My friends that work at a company end up wanting, like they feel the opposite, where they're like, I want to get out there and I want to freelance and I want to jump jobs.
Not me, but I did freelance for I mean, you know, I did it for a really long time, and I'm one of those people. I burned out. Like I couldn't find the balance, and really it wasn't like so much a financial balance thing. It's just like my brain.
It's brain balance.
Yeah, my brain like isn't cool with like I couldn't relax.
Yeah,
and this is me. But I'd go to see a movie and be like, I should be looking for clients right now. I just wrap it. and I could be totally comfortable that month, and I'd still be thinking that, like, I should be looking.
It's a hard. I have it. I mean, I've gotten used to. What starts to happen now that I'm used to it is I feel like I find stability in the instability, meaning that I'm so used to the patterns that freelance brings that they don't feel jarring anymore. So it's like I know around this time, like work is going to be really heavy, or that's usually when films start. I know around the like end of November to December time, there aren't really films starting, so you should be on something that you can work through the end of the year. Like I kind of know that. The hardest thing for me has been balancing family life with work in terms of making sure that I'm available and that there's time to do stuff, making sure that we have a family vacation each year or something where we go off and we do stuff together. But also, I think one of the hardest things has been it's finding the balance in the day-to-day, meaning like the one thing that I love about when I do get on a job that's super long is being able to build a schedule and having something you can rely on. So, you know, I like to be able to say, I'm gonna get up in the morning, you know, I go to the gym, then I go to, you know, work right after, I start my day, I work my 10 hours, I come home, I have dinner, I play, hang out with my family, put my daughter to bed, you know, whatever. Like, I like having a schedule, but what ends up happening in freelance that's jarring, the most jarring, the hardest thing for me is when that schedule shifts. So it's then like, maybe I have a job now that starts later. So now I'm like, okay, well, when do I go to the gym? When do I do this? When do I do that? Like all the things that you kind of built into your life continue to change. And there's this constant uneasiness of like figuring those things out. And that can be burnout in itself. Because at a certain point, I think your mind just says, I want to do this. I want to do this same thing every day and, you know, be challenged by it, but I also don't want to continuously have to reset it back up. So that's something that becomes a little difficult, but then as I've done it longer, I've gotten used to it. So it's as jarring. You know, it's not as jarring.
Yeah. I was gonna ask, so do you like only work on one production at a time, or is there times where you're simultaneously working on one or two, or is that not, I mean, no, is that a contract or?
There's times where I'm working on multiple things. I think it depends on the schedule. Like, I've worked for a lot of different designers, and so I have a pretty good rapport with a lot of them, but I also am able to, it depends. Like, there are some projects where I can't multitask, where like, if it's something big and I really want to focus on it, it's hard for me to split my focus. But then there's other times where designers won't need as much. So like, I might be on something full time, but there's a designer that I've worked for where I know their aesthetic. Like a lot of the times, like one of my friends, Ann Foley, she's the costume designer that does Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and then she transitioned and now she's doing a show that's going to be coming out next year called Altered Carbon. And me and Ann work really well together, and we've known each other for a long time now, but I also know her aesthetic, like in terms of like what she gravitates towards or what she likes. So I don't have to always be with her whenever we work together, right? Which is helpful because then she can depend on me, and then I know kind of if she's not there or not readily accessible, I can kind of make choices based off of what I think she might like or what she might gravitate towards. So that then makes it to where during the day, I could work on something, like work on my regular film job. So I'm at my job and I'm working on Inception. But then at night, when I come home for a couple of hours, I might draw something for Ann. So it's like, I kind of go back and forth and then kind of figure it out. And then on the weekends, like sometimes I might work on the weekends, you know, so I might be working on something else. So you can do that. You know, it's like, but you can only do it for so long. At a certain point, like I start getting to the point where I'm like, okay, I've got too many jobs. Like it's like, I've got 3 jobs. I need 2 of them to go away and I need to just have 1 job. But like at the same time, I do enjoy that challenge, you know, of being able, it does provide me somewhat of an, it does provide me some kind of creative solace to be able to switch so that I'm not just stuck in one place. But then there's other jobs like where they're so expansive, you really want to be immersed in that world. And so I need singular focus. And so I won't take on anything else.
Okay.
That makes sense. With, so like, yeah, I mean, like, you know, I think there's definitely like negatives to freelance and stuff, but there's also positives, you know, like in the sense of like a lot of the stuff that can bring anxiety and stuff can also bring like super flexibility, you know, like flexibility about like change of location, change of time, change of routine. So it can kind of keep your life really interesting too.
It does, yeah, I don't want to talk about it in a way where it seems like it's hard. It becomes hard, but you're right. It does. It does provide me with times where like I might be off, or like there also is times where I get to work from home. I think that's more was speaking to what I was trying to kind of get to, is that there'll be jobs where I physically have to go into the office, and so I get on this schedule where I'm getting up earlier, going into the office, working, and coming home. But then there's other times where I could be at home working on a project where the designer is, you know, in Australia or somewhere else, and we're working remotely, and I'm working at home for 2 months. So that part of it is really helpful, because then I get more of a family life and a home schedule. Like I have to put, it's hard because I have to put myself on an actual schedule and force myself to do stuff like, you know, like get up and get dressed and stuff. Like actually be a person and like say, still going to work. It's just work is in your house. Like I have to physically figure out how to do that. But then once I get that schedule, it's really nice to be able to do stuff like, you know, because I'm working at home, I can take my daughter to school and I can see her when she gets off of school, and, you know, those type of things. And I'm working at home, so I can get used to that schedule too. And then I think the hardest part is getting used to that schedule for a couple of months and then being jolted back into like driving to an office. So now I'm not, or, you know, but it's like I do look at it in terms of the positive and saying like it's a blessing to be able to switch and not have to be in the same place all the time. Or sometimes I get to travel. Like whenever I do the Madonna tour with Ariane, she preps in New York. So I work with Ariane usually for like a month or so at her house here in LA. And then we go to New York, and then I'm in a hotel room and I walk or take the taxi. You know, I'm working in New York for like 2 months, which is really wonderful and interesting. You know, I live there, you know, for a few months, and I get to kind of experience New York in a way. I'm working, I'm going around, I'm getting to see the tour come together. You know, trying stuff, you know, different foods, going and shopping and all that stuff. Like it's interesting because that allows me to kind of like grow, like I can learn different things. And that's been part of the job that's been helpful too. Sometimes they may fly me to Atlanta, or I may have to go to Canada and I might have to work for a little while. And so you do get that working on locations different than actually being on like vacation. You are working, so you don't get to see as much of the place, but at the same time, it does open your eyes to the way things are in different places, which has been awesome.
Yeah, I remember, like, so my first year as an art director, I took every business trip I could, because I was like, you know, for kind of wanting to prove myself and stuff like that, and meet with the clients, and I remember like people being like, oh, that's so cool, you got to go to like, you know, like Fender in Arizona or something, and it was like, yeah. Like for me, this is my own experience.
Yeah.
On the plus side, yeah, I saw something cool. On the other side, like I was at business meetings, so this is most of the time you're buying people drinks.
Right.
And it's the best explanation I could kind of make for it was it's like being on a first date with somebody you may not even like.
Yeah, but you have
to like you.
Yeah.
And you're stuck there, and then you go to a hotel room and it's just lonely. Like for me, it was really lonely. So, and you know, and I got to go to New York for the first time because of that, like with like business, like, you know, meeting a client, like going to the locations and like meeting directly with buyers and stuff. And it was cool. But like the second year, I mean, like, so it's funny because I had some staff who were like kind of mentioned it like, oh, that's cool, you got to go off on vacation, you know? Yeah. And I had to kind of clarify that because I was like, you know, there's a reason like this next year I'm not saying yes to any of these things because like it's like it's cool, but no. Like, no, but you know, I didn't have the experience of like also being able to see a film set and a location, and like there's got to be a lot of like energy and just kind of excitement like on a set, like being there, you know.
I mean, because of like my background and growing up on set, I still get really excited to go set, especially more so now because illustrators, in our sense, we're kind of like always like in a dark room somewhere on our computers drawing, and we don't really go to set. Oftentimes too, we're working in a costume house or somewhere off site. So we're not necessarily, sometimes we're on the lot, but oftentimes we're also very much so pre-production. So we're doing all the design work and like with the designer and stuff to get stuff done for when they're going to go shoot. So it's very rare, not rare, but it's more often than not that it doesn't overlap to where they're shooting while we're still working, because by the time they're shooting, stuff should kind of be done. But it does overlap in some points, and so we get to see stuff if we're around. So like if your movie's shooting here in town or in LA and you're still in working and they kind of move you and you can go to set. So I do get to go to set sometimes. When I'm on location, usually that's 4 jobs where you would go to set. Or at least be around set, and those are the ones where you get to see a lot more.
Yeah.
Actual, what's actually happening.
Yeah, get to see some of your stuff actually come to fruition too, like right there,
That's fun to see. Like when you're doing costumes and as you're working, like after that first month, maybe the costumes you first started with are now being made. It's fun to see them come to life, or to see somebody put them on, and you're like, that's cool, It's cool to draw something and then see it on somebody.
Yeah.
Which also helps you to learn.
So I'm sure you've been asked this like a million times, but describe like the first time that you were in like a theater and you saw your name in the credits of the movie.
I honestly don't remember. I think the first time was The Mummy. I don't remember if I got a screen credit for that one. I'm not sure. It's pretty cool. It's just cool to see the contribution, especially because it's on the big screen. I don't know, like, I feel humbled by it, so it's something I've never gotten over. Like, I still take pictures of, like, when I'm in the theater. Like, I'm the nerd that's like, oh, cool, or my family will send me pictures, or people will check in, like, on Facebook and send me, like, oh, we saw your name. Like, we were wondering if you worked on this, because I don't always share things right away. I usually share things later.
Yeah.
And also, there is that part of it, like, where you do kind of forget, because you have to remember, I'm working on stuff, like, within the first, like, 3 to 4 months of it, or even 2 months of it.
Yeah.
I go and move on to something else. So whereas the costume designer stays on that film and they go to set and they're filming every day and they're traveling all over the world or wherever the locations are, I've now moved on to something else. And by the time they're done with that one movie that we were working on, I've probably done, like, 1 or 2 other ones. By the time that. And so then at that point, then it's really easy to kind of get in this thing where you do forget, because then I'm just like everybody else. Past the stuff that I've seen kind of come together, once I leave, I detach. So I don't see a lot of the stuff until it actually is in the theater, just like everybody else. I might see it like a couple weeks before if there's a crew screening or something like that. But past that, I'm just as surprised as you. Like, oh, okay, what's going on? Like, let's see what they did,
Yeah.
Like packing your kids' lunch, you did it best you can, and you send them off to school, and they walk through that gate, and you're like, well, I hope this sticks. Like, I hope it's fine. And
I hope they kept that thing I liked, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you find out about it later. So I think it's kind of, at a certain point, it's not like I can't remember. Like, if I really think about it, it's just hard because I have to try and go back and, like, what was I doing during that point? Because then they all start to overlap. So now I've worked on enough projects to where I don't remember, or I physically have to go through my files. Another funny thing that we all talk about now, too, is all the movies now have code name. So when you're filming, people don't know what you're working on. But what sucks for us is that later on, like a year from now, I'll go to look up a project, and I won't remember what the code name is, and I can't find it. Like, so I'm like, what was that stupid movie called? Or I have to search by character names, which characters end up having their own code names too. So it's, you learn this whole little secret language of whatever it is, and then when you try to recall it yourself, all you can remember is, like, the actual character's name, and then you're confused because you can't find it. So I think that's kind of hard to explain to people in terms of, like, just the timing. Like, they're like, what did you work on? And I'm like, and I forget because they all overlap because my timing is off. It's like constantly being in, it feels like being jet lagged in a way. Like, you constantly are like, what time zone am I in? What's going on? Like, that's kind of what it starts to feel like after a while.
No, that makes sense, because, I mean, the whole filming and then the editing and the long production process and then the post-production, and you're in pre-production, so it's like by the time they've gone through all of that, it might be a year later or 2 years later or 3 years later that movie is released.
Yeah.
And, and then you have to sign NDAs.
Yeah.
Like, you know, you really haven't been able to talk about it much or show much, and then it's like, oh, it's out. Okay.
And you don't really show your work either, so it's like also a treat. Like, I remember Man of Steel was like one of the bigger films that I worked on at the time. Like, it was like I was building up, and I had worked on some big stuff, but I was really excited because they were redoing Superman, and it was like Zack Snyder, and he had did 300, and it was costume designer Michael Wilkinson, who I've now worked with multiple times. So I was really excited about that project, but it didn't come out. I think we started working on it in 2011, and I think it didn't come out until 2013. So there was a whole long period of time of just waiting, and it felt like forever because I forgot about it. You just forget about it. Then when it finally comes out, you're like, oh yeah, like awesome, you know? Because usually it's like a year.
Yeah.
You work on something, and then a year later it comes out. Yeah. And then animation people, it's even longer. They work on stuff for like 3 years, you know?
Yeah, I joined this thing called the National Cartoonist Society, and a lot of the dudes there, like, they work for animation companies, or like some of them like direct animated movies and stuff, and like hardly any of them can talk about what they work on.
Yeah.
It's kind of, but I mean, it makes sense. It's one thing that just came to mind that I'm just kind of curious about. Have you ever have you ever done work on a film that like you level up as an artist like a year later, and then you're like, great, I can post the work? Oh, like I was just thinking about that, because I was like, if I think back like a year, I don't know, like, you know, to me, I'm like, if I think about my own work, there might be something I did a year ago that like maybe has something cool attached to it, but like I'm not super proud of.
Oh yeah, I've got those. That does happen. There are films where people are like, "You worked on this? Where's your drawings?" And I'm just like, "Oh, I don't know." Like, I won't show them because like where I'm just like, nope. Like, I know one of the films. It was fun to work on, but my illustration. So it's like everybody has leveling up points, right? So Man of Steel was a huge level up point for me because at that point I was still kind of doing very stretched out, fashiony, kind of flat, like. I was trying to find my voice as an artist, and my illustrations weren't as strong. They were just like, it's like you're coming out of school and like you work for a costume designer that likes figures to look this way, so you try to match that. And then directly after that, you worked with someone else, so that your eye is constantly changing.
Yeah.
Either sometimes you pick up just bad habits because you're not focusing so much on the skill set, you're focusing on what people want from you. So I had to really learn to pull back to study my fundamentals so that I had something to latch onto regardless of what people were asking me to do. Because I started to be so malleable that I was starting to lose focus as to like what to do. And so I got to this point where I got hired on Man of Steel, and I'm sitting between concept artist Warren Manser and Dad. Now, if you look both those guys up separately, they're just both huge blockbuster concept artists, nicest guys in the world, but really, 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 really talented. And so I feel like a fish out of water because I'm drawing kind of flat, fashiony things, and these guys are doing like full painted 3D. Like, I mean, like just like you're looking at it, saying like I could never draw like that in my lifetime. Like ever. I don't know how these guys are doing this stuff. So it was at that point, and especially as they hired more artists, it was the first time I worked with my friend Constantine Securis and Keith Christensen, who we're all really good friends. Those guys were all really good, but they were all very much so used to doing concept art. And I was very much so used to doing costume illustration, which was more traditional, just like a fashion sketch or like a sketch with pencil and watercolor. Like, it's just a different thing. It's not the digital kind of age of like doing these full beautiful paintings or 3D renderings or whatever. So I had to learn. So that was a big level up project for me because I had to start integrating photographs into my work, which I had to try to figure out a way to take the references, use photographs, come up with something interesting, and kind of be able to not compete, but it was like compete to stay on the level so that my stuff could hold up to the stuff that was being shown around it, and I didn't stick out in a bad way.
Yeah.
So luckily, because they're my bros, like they're my brothers, like they all helped. They all kind of chipped in. And working with people that are better than you is so great. It's if you can work with anyone that you feel like their skill set is just like so much further beyond, you'll learn so much. So I always encourage that. Being around all of them really leveled up my skills, but it was painful and it was hard and I was like stressed out and I was frustrated because I was going through that point in your head where things are flat, but they're not flat. And, you know, then there's like all the things to concentrate on where you have to go back to your fundamentals, like lighting, core shadows, tone versus color, and what tone and shading, what those things do to color. So like, then I started to learn like, it's better to paint in grayscale first to figure out design and figure out everything and then add color. Because then your color doesn't become confusing, you know? So it's like, it was all of those things. And then it didn't come out for 2 years.
Yeah.
So I didn't start to really kind of understand those things until much later, like even what I had done or seeing that my work had really changed. I didn't understand it until probably a year later. And then when the film came out, those illustrations, I'm still pretty proud of them because I can see the struggle in them, but I can also see it was a point that those illustrations really helped me kind of transition from being kind of like a flat artist to a like kind of 3D kind of, or at least, you know, photo real guy that I've kind of been known to do. But then there's other projects, like I remember Ender's Game. Ender's Game is a project where I was really in that trend. So it was after Man of Steel, and it was a point where I was taking those photographic skills and bumping them up even more. So even though those illustrations worked and they helped to kind of get, like I was doing uniforms for the kids and all that stuff, to me, they feel more like working drawings and they feel like struggle. Like when I look back on them, I'm like, man, these are bad for myself.
Yeah.
The designs are fine. The designs are great, but the actual my drawing, like I look back on it still and I'm just like, I don't like them. Now, other people might look at them and not have a problem with them.
Yeah,
like I know
I wouldn't even notice, you know. But like,
costume designer Christine Beesman Clark was like, she's like a dear friend of mine. I know that she loved them. They were fine. I think that other people, it's just personally, like if you're asking me the personal question, I know that that's one of those projects where when I look at them, I see struggle, personal struggle.
Yeah.
So, and then after that, a year later or even longer after that, I did stuff that I'm so much more proud of in terms of like, I figured it out. Yeah. Then when I look back at those, I'm just like, yeah, we're just going to skip over those.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because like you've touched on so many important things. Like something we've mentioned on here a lot is like I don't know whose quote it is, but I really think what you're touching on with like the not wanting to be the smartest person in the room is like a brilliant thing. Like you want to be around people who are smarter than you. You want to be around people who are better than you at drawing, you know, because that's going to lead to that like moment of like frustration and struggle. And then something clicks and suddenly something that was inaccessible opens up, you know? And so it's like that, to me, like that's a huge thing. Like what you're even describing, being around the illustrators that kind of mentored you, it sounds like at a point where, you know, you'd probably been mentored earlier and then got to a level and mentored again and got to a level. But I think it's cool that you, it sounds like you're still in that process. And I think that's kind of part of the thing. Like we have to constantly be around people who are better than us.
It never ends. You always do that. Like I need it now because now I'm starting to do more 3D. I'm sculpting. So I'm learning ZBrush, right? So I've been doing that, and that process is just like really difficult, especially if you're coming from a place where you weren't ever trained to do 3D. But the interface and learning the program is it's just a struggle. Like you can't learn it unless you put in the time. And so being around artists like Jared Morantz and Ian Joyner, like people that really are great at that, even just for a second, just being around them really helps you to learn.
Yeah.
Better at that stuff. Also, too, some of the costume designers I work for, like all of the costume designers have their own way, but they also bring in tons of books and they have personal stories. And then you get to hear about like movies you love and what it was like to work on those. And like you get inspired by them as well. So it's kind of an interesting thing too, where like I've got a costume designer now that I've worked with that became a mentor for me, which is Jeffrey Kurland, right? So Jeffrey did Inception. He just did Dunkirk. Nice. He worked for Woody Allen for years. As like, I don't want to go too far, but he's just done a lot. And so he's mentored me. He was the first costume designer to really take me under his wing and start to tell me the stuff that you were talking about, like what's a pleat versus a sun pleat versus a kick pleat versus a dart versus a bust seam versus a gusset. Like he's the one that was really a stickler on making sure that I knew what those things are, what they do, and what their function is. And also because he really loves it. He loves him and his wife, Helene. They both love clothing. Like they love vintage clothing. They love traveling around and finding clothing. Helene loves jewelry. So it's kind of one of those things where it's like between the two of them, I kind of got this education.
Yeah.
And it was very important for him to give me the information to learn those things, but then because he's so good at it, I got better, and then it became important to me. So now I'm like, I do need to know the difference between those things because then it helps me to be better at my job.
Yeah.
More accurate. And then I also started to learn little tricks, like costume designers do things that are really interesting, like with Michael Kaplan on Star Trek, Leonard Nimoy, Spock, the one that played Spock, he, as he was getting older, his posture wasn't the best. Not like he was a complete sloucher, but you're older, right? So Michael Kaplan had this idea where he built his seams and his shoulders back so that when you looked at it from the front, he looked like he was standing up straight, even though he was slouching. It's little things like that you see in costume design that are really kind of brilliant. Or Michael also had the idea of, for the Vulcan women, he wanted to build this he was explaining to me the history of women's costume and the fact that, in every single period, there's something that, fashion tries to accentuate on a woman's body. So hips or her butt or her bust line or, cleavage or whatever it is, or, neckline. So he decided he built these shelves that went inside the Vulcan women's costumes that made it made their neck look longer, but it also kind of hollowed out the shape. Brian Valenzuela did a lot of those drawings, and ultimately that shelf, he wanted to make it to where Vulcan women valued a longer neck. So that kind of presented wisdom. He made up a character point based on historical fashion points. And I thought that was something that was a really big learning moment for me in understanding how costume design works. It's it's not always so literal. It could be based off history and you push it somewhere else,
Yeah. So oh my gosh, that's we're already pushing a long time, but I feel like we could just keep going. So we'll have to have you back on, honestly, at some point, because it's
I'd love to come back.
Yeah.
So Josh, there were two quick questions. I
wasn't going to close out.
Okay, no, I just not for me, just from the chat, since we don't usually go back to the chat. But I was going to refer to that. But go ahead, Josh.
No, go for it.
Okay, so these are both for Phillip. Who was the main person that made the design for Apocalypse, for the Age of Apocalypse movie? That was one. I don't know if you know that.
So who was the main person that did which one?
The design for Apocalypse and Age of Apocalypse.
Oh, in the movie. That's a tricky question. That whoever asked me that. That one, because that it's hard. That's basically, the concept was done by Keith Christensen. The costume designer was Luis Miggenbach, who's done a lot of the X-Men movies. And I think the house that did the actual costume is Legacy. But between, let me see if I can get back. I actually switched my screen. Between all of those, it was kind of a collaborative thing. And the concept behind Apocalypse was basically what they wanted to do with him. I think they just couldn't figure out the whole thing between making him digital, making him bigger, smaller, or whatever.
But the basic principle for him throughout the whole thing was they wanted to infuse him with history so that when you go back and look at ancient civilizations, you can't tell who came first. So it's like, did the Mayans have their own culture, or did they did they worship apocalypse? Did ancient Egyptians have their own culture, or did they worship, like, they kind of wanted to do that whole deal. So that was the basic principle behind the concept there. And that is all I will say about Apocalypse.
Okay, yeah, that's a very thorough answer. Okay, and the other one wanted to know, are you working on The Gifted show?
No, I am not.
Okay.
I know that the designer, Luis Mingenbach, did the pilot episode, the first episode, and I'm not sure, based off of, you know, everything else, who kind of continued with that. But I am enjoying it. I think X-Men, in a way, because of character development and the way characters for X-Men are, I think that I was really surprised and happy as a fan of X-Men by how television has the opportunity to be able to expand on the characters in a way where we can care about them more than you probably would get for a film. For people that are like non-fans, like if you're a fan of X-Men, you love them regardless. I've loved them forever. But TV is kind of presenting a different avenue for them, so we'll see.
Cool. All right, Josh, I'll hand it back over to you then.
Yeah, so I mean, mainly just so we'll like I said, we'll have to do this again because there's just so much, and also it's just fun to talk to you, dude. But so like outside of costume art, like you know, like what do you do when you just draw? Like when the slate's clean and you can direct it yourself. Do you have like any sort of projects or things you're working on?
Personal projects, like right now, I think that I don't know, I'm very interested in drawing things based off of like music or culture or just kind of keeping my skills up. So for a while I was practicing doing like portraiture or just different faces. Like I'm right now very much so, I feel like in an academic point where I want to make sure that my regular skills, like my traditional skills, don't lax. So I've been doing little tutorials or watching videos like, let me draw the nose, let me draw ears, let me draw eyes, let me draw like all the stuff that you would consider technically boring. Let me draw the head from different angles. Let me draw hands, you know. I've kind of been working on structural anatomical things. I'm also taking an online ZBrush course with Jared Morantz right now, where I've been kind of keeping up with that, at least in terms of trying to kind of follow and keep myself active with learning that. And then personally, I've been painting. I think because of Black Panther, I really got inspired by that, and I couldn't use all the ideas that I had there because it was just a lot. And also too, Marvel has a brilliant biz dev team of concept artists like Anthony Francisco, Ryan Meyerding, all those guys that you've seen, you know, working on the different projects. And so there was a lot of work going on there as well, where they developed a lot of the looks. So I have all this information. So I basically, long story short, now I'm working on a series of illustrations that are like African based, like in a kind of Afrofuturism, Afro-tech, Afro-punk kind of way. So that's kind of what I'm working on now, just what I'm inspired by. So it's like I'm trying to kind of take African culture and mix it up and mix it with stuff. And see where I end up. So that's stuff that I'll probably start to post at some point. That's actually what I didn't work much on it when, let me see if I was working on this, but I stopped to just talk because I was enjoying it. So I'm kind of, I don't know if you can see this. So I'm kind of working on that now, and at some point, I'll post this and start to work on clothing it and all that, but I'm working on a personal piece. So it's like I am doing kind of my own thing, and that's what I'm interested in at the moment, just because it gives me a break from superheroes and all that stuff.
It's whoa, I'm getting hang on. Okay, sorry about that. So I think that you should mention your Instagram because you just have like amazing stuff on there, and you post it a lot. If you want people to kind of check it out, I highly recommend anybody who watches this. Like most of the people who watch our channels are artists or like are aspiring cartoonists.
Yeah.
And I think most of them are like super into comics. So they'd probably love to see your stuff on Instagram as well. So if you want to mention that, what's your Instagram handle?
It's at P Boutte, P-O-U-T-T-E.
And you post a lot of like art that's similar to what was shown just now, and it's really great stuff. So thanks for coming on.
No problem. Thank you guys. I really enjoyed it. Nice to catch up with you.
It's insane, man. We like I said, I feel like we could do this for 4 hours because like there's a ton of non-art stuff I want to catch up on, but we also want to let our viewers off the hook because they're now about 2 hours deep. But that's good, like because honestly, like I said, everything I think you brought up on here is like super useful and like just really inspiring. And it's really cool, you know, to see what you've done with your career. Like it's really, like I said, I think the last time I saw your name in credits, my wife and I got somebody to watch the kid. We watched Guardians of the Galaxy, and when your name came up, we were like, Volume 2, and when your name came up, we were both like, yeah, Phil. So
that was a fun one to work on. I appreciate that. That was a month of drawing nothing but gold.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that whole race of people. That was cool.
All people, all the sovereign on Contraxia. So most of the ones that I ended up doing, the ones that made it for me are the handmaidens. So all of Aisha's handmaidens, like the people that tend to her, that roll out that stupid blue carpet in the middle of the snow, I drew all of those. So that was fun. But that process was also a great time too, because then you get your assignment and then, you know, it's Juliana McCoskey, it's the costume designer there. And she basically came in and said, Phil, we need to do these people. They are the sovereign. They are genetically perfect. They are gold. And I want them to look like columns. So think Klimt. She showed me some stuff. She actually showed me lots of different headdresses and stuff from the 20s and the 30s, from silent films and stuff like that. Like, and then we kind of worked out from there. So it was that was the assignment. Then from there, it's like draw gold people. And then I had other really talented artists. I had Kevin Chen, who did the main first concepts for Aisha, and then there was Gloria Shi, who did a lot of concepts for the same character. Then I was doing handmaidens, and then Christian Cordella was doing like the main race of all the people, like all the different classes. So there was like, you know, peasants and all these different people, all that were just gold. And we spent like a good, you know, I was there for a month, and I think that it was like they were there for like a few months, just drawing nothing. We're just drawing nothing but gold people. I could talk about all these things, but they're fun. That part of the job is really fun because you do just get to come to work every day and you're just trying to figure out like, what do I do today? You know, and Guardians is always fun to work on. That is the most funny script I've ever read. Like when I read it, I was laughing out loud, and then people in the office are like, "Oh, are you at the part where Baby Groot brings back the finger?" And I'm like, "Yeah!" Like, you know, like just it's all there. It's all funny. And are you at the part when so and so said whatever, or when Drax says, you know, something stupid? Or it was just really fun to read. You know,
it's awesome.
It plays out exactly that way. So that was a really fun one to work on, and I hope that we continue to do more because they're just funny.
Yeah. All right. Well, so Scott, did you have anything you wanted to touch on? I mean, we'll definitely have Phil back, but anything?
I'd love to come back.
Yeah, I not really. I mean, I do have a bunch of other questions, but probably, you know, we should wrap it up because if I ask another question, we'll probably keep going on because everything Phil's saying is really interesting. But yeah.
Did anybody else have questions? No other questions? I'll come back.
All right. We'll have you back on. Thanks for coming on, and I'm gonna just, I guess I'll just start. So I'm Joshua Kemble. You can check out my comic at quarterlystories.com. You probably already know that because this is my channel. And then, you know, this show alternates between channels to Scott, but we'll have Scott close it because he has the nice little wrap up and subscription info. So, Phil, where can we find your stuff once again for anybody who's gotten this far in?
Go to my Instagram at Boutte, or my Twitter, I think it's also Boutte, or my website, which is phillipboutejr.carbonmade.com. It's just like a portfolio. I'm usually really easy to find because my name is so unique. So if you just put my name into Google, all my websites pop up. Literally, it's like the first thing. So like the only one, you know, that like is in entertainment. So if you type in my name, the last name is Boutte, you usually find most of my social media.
Awesome. And then Scott, tell us where we can find your stuff, and then how people can subscribe to this show.
Okay, yeah, you can find me at Serkworks on YouTube and Instagram and Facebook and probably some other places on the internet. And as far as how this show works, like Josh said before, we kind of rotate back and forth from his channel to my channel, so we're sort of always somewhere different. Like if you go on my channel, you may see that there's some missing episode numbers, but I know I've got a playlist on my site where you can go through and you can watch them all. But just so you know where we are, we do have we call it a newsletter. It's not really a newsletter. It's just something we send out, like usually 30 minutes before each episode to let everybody. What's that?
I think that was just a blip. You're good.
Okay. All right. Yeah. But so we'll send that out, you know, usually about 30 minutes before every episode, just to let people know, you know, what channel we're on. We'll give you a link and all that stuff. So we don't spam anyone or anything like that. But if you want to know where we are or what time, and we're not always on the same day either. We may actually, I'll talk to Josh about this, but we may have to start doing more Thursdays once daylight savings time switches around and everything. But anyway, yeah, if you want to know where to find us, just sign up for that newsletter, and there's a link in the description.
Awesome. All right. We will see you guys next week. Thanks again, Phil.